All right, Troy, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me, and hopefully, we're well past all the hiccups. But I appreciate your patience. I appreciate you being here and giving me this opportunity to talk to you. And like you said, last time we chatted, there's good vibes. So I'm hoping we can carry that on. But lots to cover today, lots to cover, especially when it comes to these attachments we have to identities and labels. And that would be a good segue into some of the meditation work you do. But before we jump into all of that, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself, what's brought you here, and who you are.
Yeah, wow. Who am I? That could be a whole 3 hour conversation in itself. I have no clue who I am.
Yeah.
Still trying to figure that out. Thanks for having me, Furkhan.
Yeah.
And I always like to start because I feel like a lot of the time listeners don't always recognize how much work it takes to actually do a podcast and be a host and create a show. So before I answer your question, I want to say thank you
You're
for
welcome.
doing that and for giving people like me a voice to share. Who am I? I was born and live in Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. I've been teaching yoga for over about 15 to 20 years now, close to 20 years. I think I've been really excavating the human experience from a young age and like just asking God, show me, take me, teach me, use me from a really young age. One of my biggest teachers was this beautiful man, as Jesus, Christ consciousness. And I really connect to him now outside the box of religion. And for me, when people ask, who am I try not to put too much labels on myself and box myself in. Because if I say I'm a yoga teacher, who am I when I'm not teaching? If I say I'm an author, well, who am I when I'm not writing books? And so I just like to see that what I am is someone who's really committed to trying to help us all remember what it means to love, including myself, and creating a space where I can help people connect to their understanding of God in a different way, or even reconnect to an understanding of God that maybe they've moved away from. Because I think in the world we live in, it is so important to connect to that something bigger. And to think that something bigger has a name and a form, to me, is trying to put that in a box.
Yeah.
Which in itself is like, how can we even attempt to do?
Yeah.
Whether you call me entrepreneur, author, yoga teacher, activist, friend, coffee junkie, I'm all of it.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And there's something fascinating about trying to put things in a box, even from a metaphysical perspective. And I've come to understand when you try to put boundaries on things, whether it's yourself or even your definition of this higher power or God, you're limiting the capacity, the potential of what it could be.
Yeah.
Right? When we try to put labels on ourselves, we're limiting ourselves. Whereas, to your point, we have all these capacities available to us, right? Even any given day, you're playing different roles. So, where do you fit yourself in?
Yeah, what it also does is we become so attached to this idea of identity that when that aspect of our identity is threatened or changes, our attachment creates so much suffering, right? And an example of this that would be close to home to anyone is that if I was a school teacher and then in a pandemic, all of a sudden I couldn't teach anymore, then my identity is now threatened, not to take pandemic on its own isn't uncomfortable enough, but I'm now threatened in a whole different way. If I identify only as a school teacher, who am I now if I can't teach? And there's so many ways in which that shows up in our lives because we get so attached to these ideas of our identity, even opinions. If to use the pandemic again as an example, even it was a few years ago, even if my opinion And my identity is one in which maybe I'm what they would call anti-vax.
Mm.
And all of a sudden, I meet someone who's pro-vax. Then we're on different teams. No, we're not on different teams. We just have different opinions and perspectives. But we identify so strongly, even with our ideologies and our opinions, that when somebody has a different opinion or perspective, it's almost like we're under attack.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like we're personally being attacked. And that's not it at all. Someone just has different opinion.
Yeah, and I think part of it is, at least what I've come to understand, is it's because we're not confident in our own opinion, right? Like when you're confident in your opinion, then you don't feel threatened when someone else has another opinion. And you're actually open to hearing their side of it because you're so in tune with yourself, you're grounded within yourself. It's only when you're not having that sense of firmness within yourself that you'll feel threatened by someone else's opinion. And a lot of the times that anger or the anxiety or uncomfortable feelings that we project onto other people is because of something that's happening inside of us.
And let me add to that, because I think that's a beautiful point. But to go back to your point about drawing a box, I think it's not only confidence in our opinion, but it's the openness to realize maybe that our opinion might be wrong.
Yes.
Opinion might be wrong. So it's a confidence, but it's also a readiness and to grow and to recognize that what we thought was true might actually not be true, that we might have been misaligned for the last 40 years of our lives and not realize it. And I think that openness and readiness to be a student of life and recognize that maybe there's still something for us to learn. There's a balance between our confidence and our knowing and our readiness to learn more. And I think when we lock ourselves into a box too rigid and say, we're so confident this is our belief, that it's almost like we become stubborn and blind to everything else. Whereas if we loosen that attachment to any opinion or belief, then we're able to consider that maybe what we believe is true or what we know to be true might actually not be.
Yeah, and I think that's having a sense of openness, as you're touching on. And I think, as you were talking about earlier, even people's idea of God can be rigid because they try to define it. But at least based on my understanding, my faith system and some of the other faith systems I looked into, in fact, I've been reading about the Bhagavad Gita, which is part of Hinduism, very similar. The idea of God is that you can't really define it. It's formless. So it's just so vast, and very similar to what we've talked about thus far. Is if you try to put it in a box, that's when you end up putting yourself in a difficult position because you're trying to define something that cannot be defined.
Yeah, it's so funny. I was thinking about this just driving at our studio for this call, because lately for me, so much has come up around people identifying with different, what's the word I want to use? Different interpretations of forms of God, right? And to me, if we really step back and look at it, it's actually so ridiculous that we have all these religions that says there's only one God. But because of all of them put a different name and form to that one God, all of a sudden we perceive it as separate gods. My God and your God become different gods. Now my God is the right God and your God is the wrong God. And it is so ridiculous. Like, how hard is it for us to really just take a step back and realize that we just have different names and interpretations of that one God, and that's okay. I was having a conversation with my mom recently, and my mom grew up in a Catholic home, and my mom is such an amazing, beautiful woman, and definitely a woman of God. And she's 80, I think, and we were having a chat the other day, And I can't remember what we talked about, the state of the world, that he was so concerned about the state of the world and what's going to happen. She gets quite emotional. I think his convo was, how could God let this happen?
Mm.
And I drew a reference from Yuval Noah Harari,
Mm-hmm.
Sapiens. And I heard him say in an interview something that's so powerful if you really grasp it. He says, we have to understand that man is not separate from nature. Man is part of nature.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the constants in nature is the cycle of life.
Mm-hmm.
And not because something might be life-taking means that it's bad. Hurricanes, tornadoes, or that is not natural, right?
Mm-hmm.
So much things in nature, some things give life and some things take life. And it's inevitable that at some point, Homo sapiens will cease to exist,
Yeah.
right? And I brought this point to my mom, and God came up again, and I was like, Mom, God existed before religion. And she paused for a moment. She said, what do you mean? I said, not because we gave God a name and a form means that, like, we didn't invent God. God didn't start at that point in time when he gave it name and form. Like,
Yeah.
God has always existed long before we even knew
Mm-hmm.
that entity existed. And she paused for a moment and she was like, wow, I never thought of it like that. But it's so obvious that this intelligence, this divine intelligence has existed.
Yeah.
And not because we call it different names or put it in different boxes means that it's actually different.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And I think that's probably leads into the whole idea, because we're been focused on labels and identity. And you've shared with me that one of the meditations you like to do is to meditate on no identity or labels. Why is
Yeah.
that?
Well, to be honest, that is something that came to me recently. Because normally I teach Vinyasa Yoga, Asana, and yes, one or two guided meditations. But my approach to meditation generally is just allowing someone to be still, allowing them to quiet your mind and just look, just observe. Because that's been my experience. So I can't say I've ever been dove in too much to leading guided meditations as such, right? But I do have content on Gaia.com. Recently went there to film some more content for Gaia. And they wanted me to lead this guided meditation. And I was like, all right. So it really got me thinking into what can I deliver that will really hit home for people. And so I came up with this meditation, which I've used a few times since. But I remember when I first put it forward, they were like, wow, that's intense. We don't know if people are ready for that.
Hmm.
And so I had to butt it down a little. But it's like this for any of us on this spiritual path or journey, whether that is within religion or outside religion or whatever. I think we're all on spiritual journey. It looks different for all of us. But we all connect to something bigger than our physical one. And I think in some form, we can all say, yes, there is some existence after we leave our body, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if that is the case, then that means I am not my body, right? That means I am not my body. Much like I am not this black shirt I am wearing, because tomorrow I'll be wearing a different shirt. So clearly, I am not this black shirt.
Mm-hmm.
So if we really, not just say we believe, but if we truly understand that there's existence beyond our body, that means we truly understand that I am not my body, right? But do we really? Because what that means is understanding that we are not the layers of identity that we attach to.
Mm-hmm.
I am not my opinion. I am not my religion. I am not my nationality. I am not my race. I am not my role in society. And all of these layers of identity have a hold on us,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's if I am white and someone is of color, all of a sudden I've created separation.
Yes.
If I am Trinidadian and you, Furkhan, are Canadian, are you Canadian?
Yeah.
If I remember correctly, yeah. Then I've created difference and separation.
Yeah.
If I am pro-vax, someone is anti-vax, I've created separation and division.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these layers of identity paint. Look at what's happening in the world today,
Mm-hmm.
right? In Palestine and Gaza and Israel, that is an identity crisis in its fullest form,
Mm-hmm.
painting us as separate and different. It's everywhere. In my opinion, it's the very root of all that is wrong,
Mm-hmm.
all that is misaligned. It's this idea that we are individuals and we have an individual identity,
Mm-hmm.
right? So this meditation it's easy to say, yeah, there's life after I leave my body. It's easy to say, yeah, I am not my body. I am not my thoughts. That is really powerful stuff. But can we actually say, I am not white?
Mm-hmm.
I am not a man.
Mm-hmm.
I am not Trinidadian. I am not Christian or Islamic.
Mm-hmm.
To really understand, I had the design on this beautiful line of clothes I just certainly released, and one of the designs says, I am a descendant of spirit and my ancestry is love.
Mm-hmm.
Do we understand that? Because even this idea of ancestry that we attach to in such a strong way, ancestry is just a label you put on something along one point in the timeline of history.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, there were no borders that created nations. At some point, there was no race that separated us as human beings. So why are we stopping upon that one point in history that reinforces our narrative of difference, of otherness? Why don't we go all the way back to spirit? Why are we not identifying with that? Identifying with source? Because it is in that source that we remember who we are. And it is in that source that we recognize that we're very much the same. We're not as different as we've been led.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what you find and what I tell people, funny enough, I taught this, I guided this meditation last night at the end of the class. And of course, you could have things like, I am not white, cool, I could say that. I am not Trinidadian, cool, I'm okay saying that. I am not a man, okay, I'm okay saying that. I'm not a yoga teacher, I feel good saying that. And then we might say something, I am not a father, I am not a mother, I am not. But all of a sudden you find that you hit aspects of your identity that you don't feel right denouncing. And those are layers of your identity that have the greatest hold on you. And those are layers of your identity that you are somewhat attached to, and they will cause you immense suffering if we can't cultivate a new relationship to that. And it's, I won't say I feel like a hypocrite, but I am not a father. I do not have children of my own. I play fatherly roles. And I can only imagine that identity as being a father or a mother is one of the hardest, would be one of the most challenging to overcome. And it's something like, I imagine that if I was a father, I would imagine that if I one day had to say I am not a father, I would say something like, I am not a father, but I do have a son. Something that kind of reminds me that I'm not going to let this role define me, but I will acknowledge the blessing it has brought into my life.
Yeah.
But there's something about that narrative of I am, that sense of identity. I've been thinking about this so much, Furkhan, and wow, I don't even know if I should say this because I know it's going to trigger people so much, some people. I grew up in a Catholic home,
Yeah.
and I want to make this very clear. Christ is, I love him above and beyond. He is my absolute greatest teacher,
Mm-hmm.
and I have given him my entire life, and I will every day of my life. But I connected him outside of the box. I've removed the box
Mm-hmm.
because I can't, while I connect entirely to the teachings of the Christ that I know,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like organized establishment has in a lot of ways moved away from what I know Christ would teach
Mm-hmm.
or represent.
Mm-hmm.
So I cannot relate to that box, that interpretation of that box. I have no judgment against it,
Mm-hmm.
but it is just not for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to point this out because I don't want, first chapter in my book, it's called Redefining God. And I want to make sure that people understand this is not an attack. I'm not attacking organized religion. I think it's a really beautiful thing. But one of the things for me that doesn't sit right for me is this idea of I can be okay with the words of being born into sin,
Mm-hmm.
as in born into the world of sin. But I am not okay with saying I am a sinner.
Mm-hmm.
Because then I am defining myself as a sinner.
Mm-hmm.
And I do not think that is what Christ came to teach us.
Mm-hmm.
I think he came to teach us the absolute opposite. He came to teach us that we are children of God.
Mm-hmm.
He said the words, you will do far greater things than I have ever done.
Mm-hmm.
The kingdom of God is within you.
Mm-hmm.
So while we may live in a world where there's so much sin and temptation and wrongdoing, I am not going to define myself by saying I am that.
Mm-hmm.
Because that is not a narrative I buy.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that each one of us can embody the love and divinity that Christ came to show us. That is why he came.
Mm-hmm.
He came to show us what is possible. And then he said, you can do this. And that is the story and narrative that I connect.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that. And a couple of themes that I do want to pick up on, because initially you were talking about the whole idea of separation. When we start defining ourselves, we immediately create the separation. And then the other thing you shared there with respect to the teachings of Jesus, for example, the whole notion of the kingdom of God is within you. So I want to explore that a bit further because I feel personally there is all this separation in the world amongst people because I believe we're separated from God. We're not able to find that kingdom within us, and we can't see that divinity in other people because it's within all of us, and that's why there's this separation. There's this hate because we feel separated. But to your point, if you were to draw back that source of where we all came from, where did we all come from? So why is there this separation now? And I think that's the biggest piece. And part of our spiritual journey in this world is to remove that separation from God, to come closer. And then the closer you get, the more you realize that none of this is worth it. None of this hate, none of this otherizing or divisiveness or killing is worth it. Because as you said earlier too, at the end of the day, when this is all over, there's another place we go. So this is not our forever abode.
Yeah. And you know what's even, now we all know that, right?
Mm-hmm.
We all know that innately. What's sometimes important for us to recognize that we don't always connect the dots to. No one is going to remember our names.
Mm-hmm.
No one is going to remember who we are. They're not going to remember what we did. None of it. At some point, whether your name is Bob Marley, Nelson Mandela, or Albert Einstein, or whatever, there will be a point in time when there's no remnants of your existence as an individual,
Mm-hmm.
no matter what you do.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to digress too much, but I do believe there's immortality.
Mm-hmm.
All of us, we are immortal because we are energy.
Mm-hmm.
And in resonance and vibration of our lives, that is who we are. It is impossible for Furkhan and Troy to leave this conversation as the same individuals who came in. It is even impossible for the listener to end this podcast as the same individual who stepped into it,
Mm-hmm.
who tuned in. It's impossible
Mm-hmm.
because we have now changed one another. I live in you and you live in me. So every interaction I have from this point on, you will live in that, Furkhan.
Yeah.
And I will live in yours. And therefore, those interactions you have with other people, I will live in them too. And far beyond when we leave our bodies, we will exist. Our contribution to the evolution of human consciousness will live forever. That is our immortality. That is who we are.
Mm-hmm.
That is who we are. We are not this body. But what was your question? Sorry.
No, there's no
I
question.
digress.
But just to add
Yeah.
to your point, we're also breathing the same air, right? So there's something
Yeah.
to factor in there. The other piece I do want to come back to, because I did feel a sense of discomfort and resistance as you were talking about shedding those labels and identities.
Yeah.
And, being a man, that's all I've known myself as, or even as a father, I take a lot of pride and responsibility. But I'm just curious to explore something with you, because some of these identities give us a sense of purpose in life. But to your point, it's the attachment that creates the suffering, right? And I see this with a lot of people when
Yeah.
their relationships end or they lose their job. There's so much turmoil because so much of their identity or who they are as an individual is tied up to that role.
Yeah.
But I could feel that discomfort around shedding that label, even as a father, because I can't see myself being anyone else, at least for the rest of my life.
Yeah, yeah. And it's so important, right? We have this, in the New Age spiritual world, you have a lot of people now want to kill their ego, to kill my ego. And ego is not bad.
Mm-hmm.
Ego is our biggest teacher,
Mm-hmm.
right? To say that the ego or the sense of individual identity was bad would be to call the human experience useless, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's so intelligently designed, this human experience. It has its role, and its role is to teach us to love, to remind us who we are, right? It has its purpose. But like you rightfully said, if that overcomes us and we forget who we truly are, that is the source of all disconnect and suffering in the world.
Mm-hmm.
That is the very source of it, right? If we can remember who we truly are, when you brought up the importance of connecting to God, and when I would write in a book, the very first chapter is called Redefining God. And I had to contemplate that for a moment because I was like, I knew someone can open that chapter and say blasphemy.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody could open that chapter and it could peel them off completely. And I had to realize if somebody has that reaction to that chapter, this book is not for them. But more importantly, the intention of that chapter is not to criticize anyone's understanding of God at all. It is actually to bring people who have moved away from God back to God.
Mm.
To give them the permission to redefine their own understanding of God. Because here's the thing, Furkhan. If I don't believe, if someone does not connect to some understanding of divine intelligence, then me and you always remain separate. Then I will always just be my body, and I will do, and here's what that leads to. If I am my body, then my absolute priority is self-preservation. Because my body only has one certainty, and that is that. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So the conditioning of the mind is that I am my body. And the mind knows that your body has one certainty of death. So your mind, your ego's absolute priority and conditioning is self-preservation.
Mm-hmm.
If we allow that to overcome us, and we don't have a conscious relationship to that, we will never understand what love is.
Mm-hmm.
We will never understand what love is.
Yeah.
For us to even get, and somebody might say, I love my children. Sure, your children are part of your identity. I love my family. Yes, your family is part of your identity. But can we expand our love beyond
Mm-hmm.
this sense of individual identity, right? And if we don't cultivate this relationship to all things ego, then that is going to become our unconscious program.
Yeah.
It's so funny because it's not funny at all. Ironic is the better word. Because I bring this up. This is a whole religious conversation that again, I just want to stress I'm not condemning or judging any idea or understanding of God. But for me, it's I have a piece I'm working on, and it starts with I will not fear God. I do not fear God. I love God,
Mm-hmm.
and I trust Him. And fear and love can't coexist, I don't believe, not to my understanding of
No.
love. Because, you know what, let me rephrase this. Let's talk about a relationship with Furkhan and Troy, right?
Yep.
I say this is a friendship like with brothers, right? If I am doing something to please Furkhan because I am afraid of Furkhan's reaction to me and judgment of me, then my action is not out of love, it's out of self-preservation.
Mm-hmm.
It's a self-love. I am living in a certain way because I'm trying to preserve myself and your view and reaction to me.
Mm-hmm.
That is a love of self,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Whereas if I know that Furkan will be pleased if I do X, Y, and Z, and I do something not out of the fear of judgment, but out of my deep desire and love for Furkan to bring him joy, then that's a different kind of love.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I want to, and I ask every day for God to show himself to me everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Because I want to live in a way that is pleasing to this divine intelligence, that can love him in every way possible in the eyes of every human being, right?
Yeah.
That's not easy. Am I able to do that? Absolutely not.
Mm-hmm.
But until the day I leave my body, I'm going to try. And I'm going to keep trying. And I want to live that way because of my love of divinity. Because of my love of God. Not because I'm afraid of where I might end up if I.
Yeah. When I think there's an aspect of that love, as you're explaining, it's a two-way street, right? So when, again, in that divinity sense, if God loves you, then there should be no fear, right? And there's this whole notion of God having this mercy and compassion and understanding that you can do no wrong. Like even if you were to do something wrong, you can always repent. So why is that
Yeah.
concept there if we were meant to live in fear? And I think a lot of people project they're very similar to what we were talking about right at the beginning. They project their own sense of shame outwards and say, oh, yeah, they're, and you're talking about religious institutions. There's so much shame built into those, unfortunately, too, where everyone's just condemning each other and shaming each other. And what I've come to realize is that this relationship that I have with the divine is mine alone. It's personal. I don't need to explain it to anyone. I don't need to do certain things to appease others because at the end of the day, I die, I'm going by myself. And
Yeah.
wherever I'm going, that's a solo journey. Just like I was born, I came in here to this world by myself, right? Obviously, I had my
Yeah.
parents to facilitate that, but at the end of the day, you come in and you go by yourself. So that relationship, that connection you have is yours alone. And when I started to accept that and embody that, really changed my life. And I no longer felt that pressure or the shame that I used to often internalize. And then the other idea of self preservation around our body, and you were talking about how nature has this way of these cycles, whether it's natural disasters or there's this constant reminder. Like, this is why I love going into nature, because there's this constant reminder of death and birth. And it's just this dichotomy, right? It just, things flow in that way. Everywhere around you can identify with death and you can identify with birth. And same with us. Parts of us are
Yeah.
dying every day. So there is that constant reminder for us if we choose to look at it.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever practiced yoga, Furkhan,
I do. Yeah.
but in any practice of yoga, there's Shavasana.
Yeah.
Shavasana is the final rest pose. And Shavasana, for listeners who might not be familiar, is a posture we do at the end of every practice. And in my opinion, it's not negotiable. It's one posture you have to do, even if you do that alone, right? And it's where we just lie with our palms up, toes out, and it represents a corpse. It's corpse pose, right? It represents and embodies death.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, the more I practice and I teach yoga, I realize how powerful that posture really is. Because I don't think a lot of people understand. It's a practice of dying. It's a practice of that final act of surrender, that conscious surrender, that ultimate act of faith. Mm. It's a practice of consciously letting go to that, to join that sea of collective consciousness once again, wherever and whatever that looks like. And I feel like the more every day when I am lying Shavasana in my own practice, or when we all lie in Shavasana, I feel we get that much closer to remembering who we are, to loosening that hold of that individual identity on us. Almost like it makes it that much easier when that time is finally gonna come. Or at least I hope so.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's all you can hope for. Yeah. I do want to come back to your book because you've referenced it a couple of times. But before we jump into the idea of the title and what was your motivation behind it, you've touched on that first chapter of redefining God. And your goal is really to bring people closer to God. So, two questions here. Why is that a goal of yours? And why do you feel people resist the idea of God so much that they need to be brought closer?
Yeah. I think it's really important because, like I mentioned earlier, if someone does not have some relationship to something bigger, then they will always remain separate and other, and they will always view everyone else as separate, and they will never understand their place in a larger collective, right? They will always, whether consciously or unconsciously, their priority will always be preservation, whether it be preservation of individual self or preservation of family or preservation of their little circle or clique. They will always see themselves as separate and never be able to glimpse that larger life. I also begin to believe there is absolutely so much power in connecting to the divine in whatever form. And I believe the divine speaks to each and every individual. I really do. Didn't stop at Moses and the burning bush. Continues to speak. We just don't always listen. Right? And what was your second one? Oh, why are people moving away from it? That to me is pretty obvious, Furkhan. I think I say in the book too as well, I completely understand why someone might choose to be an atheist. I get it. There have been so much misalignment done in the name of God, so much suffering brought upon humanity in the name of God, so much division in the name of God, so much wrongs and misalignment. I get it. I can completely understand why someone might look at the history of religion, all religions, none in particular, and say, I want nothing to do with that. But it would be a real shame if we allow history to rob from us a relationship with the divine. That would be an absolute shame. So I understand why someone might be, excuse my language, traumatized. It's almost like we have religious PTSD.
Yeah.
And want nothing to do with God. Some people might just hear me say with God and there's a twitch that happens. They might turn off the podcast right away. That needs to change.
Yeah.
That absolutely needs to change. And people need to be given the permission to redefine their own relationship to God, because that's the only way we're going to remember our divine connection to each other. And it's so, so important. I've even had somebody ask me, do you think we have to use the word God? Can we use another name for God? And my reply was, yeah, you can make up whatever name you want. This is your relationship to God.
Yeah.
But I choose to use the word God for a very specific reason. Because if I choose to use a different name to God and I make up my own name to God, I feel like energetically I'm doing two things. I'm saying that my God is different from your God. So I'm just going to create a different God and put my understanding of God in that box. And what I do is I feed that division and that otherness, right? The second thing that's really important to me, I can't correct the misalignment and understanding done in the name of God if I don't use the word for God. In order for me to that's not even a word. In order for me to correct the misalignment, the misunderstanding and misinterpretation of God, but in the past, in decades and centuries of that happening, I have to use it with God. And I will use it with God, Allah, Hanuman, Shiva, Krishna. I will use whatever name. I have no problem using different names and forms of God, because to me, God is spirit. He can take whatever form he wants. And sometimes I wonder, how we have this teaching that we as human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. I think we are. But I think what we've done is we've taken egotistic characteristics and placed them on God. Yeah. Rather than taking divine characteristics and trying to embody that ourselves. Yeah. Which is, to me, unconditional love. That's the divine characteristic I'm speaking of. Yeah. Right? So we've created an understanding of God that gets offended if we use a different name or look in a different direction and use him as a different form. And that just, to me, I can't see that being God's characteristic or temperament.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
He's everywhere.
Yeah.
He's in everything.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And I think to your point earlier, people often, unfortunately, associate the behaviors and choices of other people with God. And then they say, okay, that's a representation of God. And that's often not correct. And that's where a lot of that religious trauma does come in for people, unfortunately. And that's part of the journey, right? You have to work through that.
Yeah, you know what, Furkhan? We have a responsibility to bring that back, bring people back to God. And you know what? If what someone understands as God, if their relationship to God is within the realm of organized religion, that is beautiful. So it's important also to note that there are amazing, beautiful things that have come through organized religion, uncountable things. People, men and women of God, have walked this earth and lit our hearts on fire and brought such intelligence and an energy that cannot be denied. And so it's important as well to understand we're not condemning any form of organized religion. I just want to make God more accessible.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And again, coming back to labels full circle, I can appreciate why the name of your book is My Name is Love. But do you want to expand on that a little bit further? Like, why did you choose that title for your book?
Yeah, it was called something else up until 6 months before we published. And my editors and one or two advisors literary world. It was a consensus for the book carries way too much depth to be called popcorn in my pocket. Popcorn in my pocket seems flowery and jokey and fun, but this book is carries a lot more. Like it can move people. It can really move your reader. I'll almost guarantee a reader that they will be moved in some way by reading this book. But so we knew we had to change the name. So then, well, what name do we use? And the underlying thread throughout the book is the book highlights all these different ways in which our sense of identity gets in the way from us understanding who we are and being able to embody that. And I believe this identity begins from the second we're born and we're given a name. And then we think that this body is Troy and this is who I am. And right now in the world, you have so many people identifying with so many things, and all of it creating more separation and division. So for me, the only thing I can really truly identify with is love and spirit. Yeah. So my name is Love. We're not all that different. It was just the name of a book just landed. It was, when it came, it was almost obvious.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Well, Troy, this has been a great conversation. I've really appreciated your insight and wisdom and everything you've shared. You've obviously been on quite the adventure, so it's always interesting to hear where people end up. But I know we covered a lot of ground, but is there anything else you want to add before we bring this to a close?
Sure, and I'll try and make it quick because I think it's so very important, right? Because we're navigating a human experience. And that human experience, we all have relationships. And those relationships, people hurt us, people do us harm, we have emotions, we get angry. It's hard for us to forgive sometimes. We label people as bad or as X or Y or Z. And I just want to offer that it's important for us to remember that if I am not my body, that also means I am not my words, my actions, and my thoughts. These are all just aspects of my conditioning. So I would love to invite people to, if they can even glimpse this, to understand that an individual is separate. Who they are is not their body. You have them. And they are that seed of God that lives in every human being. That's who they are. That spark of divinity. And then you have their conditioning. And their conditioning is what shapes them to show up in the world in a certain way. And sometimes their conditioning is very dark and very heavy. And they're carrying a lot of stones. But it's so important to understand that I could condemn someone's conditioning and I could condemn their actions, words, and thoughts while still loving them. And if I love someone, if I see inside of Furkhan the spark of God, and I understand that his conditioning and experiences are dark and heavy, so I am condemning his actions, words, and thoughts, then we have a responsibility. I have a responsibility to show up for Furkhan and help him recondition, reprogram, to show him an alternative way of living and showing up in the world. But the first step to me doing that is to make him feel seen, heard, and understood, to make him feel loved. And I think if we start to approach our lives and our relationships with this understanding, then forgiveness is no longer an option. It's inevitable. It's inevitable. And there's a quote I put on my hand that I'll share with you. And it's in my book, but I've looked up the author and I've got ChatGPT give me like 100 different authors. So I know we don't really know the authors. But it says, I have not come to teach, I have come to love will teach.
Mm.
And that's what I would leave our listeners with today.
Thank you, Troy. That was beautifully put. And hopefully you find out who the author is. But
Yeah.
sometimes you don't need to know. It's just the words that matter.
Yeah.
So,
And I don't, whoever the author is, I don't think they really care anymore.
no.
They don't care that we know who it is, that we put a name on it.
Yeah, that's fitting with everything we've talked about with labels and identities.
Yeah.
So, no, Troy, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. If listeners want to find your book or your work, I know you've talked about your clothing design and all of that. Where can they find
Yeah.
all this?
My website is troyhadeed.com. They can buy my book there. They can also get a book on Amazon. The Audible comes out in September 2024, hopefully by the end of September. And I'm narrating it myself. So if you want a cool Trinidadian accent to listen to, I got you. And yeah, I did. I'm wearing one of the sheets now, actually. It says, I identify as love. So it's a little clothing line I just popped off. It's called We Identify as and I will send you a link as well to get a coupon code where you can offer your listeners a little discount. And I'm guessing you could put it in the show notes.
Absolutely.
Is that good?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll make that happen too. But yeah, I am most active on Instagram. So if anybody wants to reach out with any questions or comments, I'm on Troy Hadeed and troyhadeed.com. And I'm here if they need anything at all.
All right. Thank you so much, Troy.
Yeah, love. Thank you, Furkhan.